I'm going to start just by introducing myself. I'm Murray Finch, General Manager of Mull and Iona Community Trust and also a member of Mull and Iona Ferry Committee. The subject for the webinar this evening is a catamaran, possible future ferry for the Craignier to Oban route. I'm just going to give a few details on housekeeping before we do start. The proceedings will be recorded, so in case anybody who's not able to attend wants to see the proceedings and understand what the outcome of the webinar has been. We have two speakers this evening. We're going to start with Professor Alf Baird and then Joe Reed. They're allocated something like 30 minutes for each of their presentations, and I can see Joe giving a wry smile there. And we'll follow the second presentation with a question and answer session. There'll be plenty of time for questions. I'm hoping that we're going to be finished for around about 9:15. There are a total of four panel members on the webinar. There's Joe Reed, Alf Baird, Finlay MacDonald, who is also a member of Mull and Iona Ferry Committee, and myself. If during the presentations you have questions that you'd like to raise for discussion, we will take the questions in the question and answer session, but please feel free to raise the questions as they arise so that you don't forget them and we can prepare for them. If your question is directed at any one of the panel members in particular, just please mention that when you ask the question. Please don't use the chat function, just try to keep focused on the questions and answers. So I'm going to give my introduction now to Professor Alf Baird, who prior to his retirement in 2016 was Professor of Maritime Business and Director of the Maritime Research Group at Edinburgh Napier University. He has a PhD in Strategic Management in Global Shipping. His specialist area of research and teaching is Strategic Management in Maritime Transport. His research activities encompass most of the world's main shipping markets in Europe, Asia, Mid East, and North and Latin America, and Australasia. He's published more than 200 research articles, delivered over 150 conference papers, many as an invited speaker at major maritime industry events, also winning several international prizes for his applied research work and development of applied theoretical and analytical frameworks in areas such as port privatization, strategic management in shipping, container transshipment, and shipping service feasibility studies. He developed his own master's module in strategic management in maritime transport, which was taught to postgraduate students at several of the major maritime universities in Europe and further afield. He's advised international ports, shipping lines, governments, and parliamentary committees on a range of maritime matters, with emphasis on shipping markets, maritime policy, and seaport planning and development. He began his maritime industry career in the 1970s, working as a shipping clerk and ship agent in the port of Leith during what were the formative days of containerization, ferry and cruise shipping, after which he joint owned and managed a transport logistics and freight forwarding business prior to entering the academic research sphere, where he continued with an emphasis on maritime business research and in particular strategic management in shipping and seaports. And I have to say I feel quite humbled to be in such company. So I'm going to hand over now to Alf, who's going to start with his presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Murray, and good evening, everyone. I think we're ready to go. Can you hear me okay, Murray?
Yes, we can hear you.
Yep, I'll just go ahead then.
Yeah, you share screen.
Yep. My presentation is entitled Scottish Ferry Fallacies. Most of us know what fallacies mean, but so I won't go into too much explanation about that. So the presentation is quite concise and hopefully relatively speedy. We're going to look at the issue monohull and catamaran, and look at look at this in the context of efficiency, emissions, cost, and also some general fallacies about catamarans in Scotland. So first of all, most of us will be aware the key difference between a monohull and a catamaran is the number of hulls. So a monohull has one hull, a catamaran has two. There are, of course, trimarans and also pentamarans, 5 hulls, but I won't go too much into that. The key difference you can see here is the monohull tends to be quite a large bow structure on the right-hand side, as you can see, whereas the catamaran...
Excuse me, Alf.
Yep.
We're not seeing your presentation slide.
You're not seeing the slide?
So you just need to share screen.
Share screen. Yep, you got it now?
Yes, we got it.
Right, I'll just go back to the overview. Monohull, catamaran, efficiency, emissions, cost, and then some fallacies. So the first slide here is showing the difference between the monohull and the catamaran being the number of hulls. But the key thing I wanted to point out here is the large bow structure on the monohull compared to the very slender hulls on the catamaran, and the large space between them, which is usually called the tunnel, where the water flows through. So the amount of ship in the water in the catamaran case is much less than the monohull. The next slide, can you see this, Murray? Yep.
Yes, we're getting it fine now, Alf.
Getting it fine. Okay, I just wanted to check. The first slide I've entitled Revenue Deadweight. Here we can see the function of the ship in terms of deadweight and displacement. The key thing here is the displacement, and we can see with the monohull the displacement is more than twice. This is for comparative vessels in terms of capacity of car capacity, about 80 cars, the two vessels, catamaran and monohull, but the displacement of the monohull is twice that of the catamaran for a similar deadweight. What this works out at is that the revenue deadweight of the monohull is about half that of the catamaran, which means that you require much more vessel to carry a given deadweight in the case of the monohull. This provides an efficiency advantage to the catamaran of about 50%. So in terms of deadweight over displacement, the catamaran has a distinct advantage. This works through into all the other aspects that we will see, including cost and power and emissions. The next slide shows the emissions. The catamaran on the left, you can see, has a power of 4 megawatts, whereas the monohull requires a power of 8 megawatts. So we have twice the power. And of course, relatively straightforward calculation here, the fuel consumption is also twice that of a catamaran. For a similar volume of car spaces, the car spaces in this catamaran, which is actually the 70-meter Pentalina, is 75 cars. That's without a mezzanine hoistable deck. Had it with a mezzanine hoistable deck, it would be even more. But even at that, the power requirement is still half. Then the emissions, as we can see further down, is about 43% less emissions overall, giving a saving over the 25-year lifespan of a ship of about 106,000 tons of CO2. This is all a function of displacement as well as, and then which comes into then engine power requirement. We then look at cost, and here I've got costs going back to 2008 for the catamaran at 7 million, as opposed to the monohull at that time, 25 million, which actually relates to the Finlagan compared to Pentalina, which were both ordered at the same time, oddly enough, in 2007 and 8. However, the catamaran took only 2 years to build, whereas the monohull, as far as I remember, took 4 for delivery. Updated prices in 2018 for these two vessels were £12 million for the catamaran, 40 million for the monohull. So we see it's still a 3 times ratio, 3 times the cost of the monohull is 3 times the capital cost of the catamaran. The operating cost is another aspect here, and I've estimated operating costs in the past here, showing that the operating cost of the catamaran is much less than a half of that of the monohull. This is largely a function of not just the lower capital cost, but also the far lower fuel cost and the lower crewing cost. This provides an annual saving of around £5 million in operating costs every year. And we have to look at a ship life cycle of around 25 years. So a poor ship acquisition decision is not just a one-off in terms of capital cost, it's a legacy lasting the lifetime of the ship, which is 25 years or more in the case of ferries. So here we can see a cost difference of approaching £140 million over the lifetime of the ship. So not only is the capital cost vastly less for the catamaran, the operating cost is enormously different. And for a fleet in the Western Isles of, say, 10 major ships, that works out as a cost saving of about £1 billion over the lifetime of the ships in operating costs alone, which is oddly enough the same as the 8-year subsidy at the moment. So I just want to go over some of the key, what I've called competitive differences between catamarans and monohulls. And here on the left-hand side column, I'll just concentrate on that. The monohull is more expensive to buy and operate. It's 3 times the cost of a catamaran. The monohull takes twice as long to build compared to a catamaran. And that's also a function of its much higher displacement. There is a lot more material and engines and decks and all sorts of superstructure going into a monohull compared to a catamaran. And that is why it takes longer to build and it costs so much more. It requires twice the power of a catamaran, and engines themselves aren't cheap. It has double the fuel consumption and CO2 emissions of a catamaran. So that's the vessel comparison, but we also have to look at the pier costs, and everybody will be aware of the very high cost of pier developments in the Western Isles, as we are in the Northern Isles. But the longer hull of the monohull, typically now 100 meters, as opposed to 70 or 80 meter catamaran, requires a much more costly pier. And a key difference here is also the draft of the vessel. The wider beam catamaran has a draft 1/3 less than the monohull. So 2.5 meter draft or thereabouts, whereas the monohull requires 3.5 or more. That requires much more work at the pier to dredge and deepen and maintain a depth at the pier. So the infrastructure cost of the monohull in the ports is much, much greater. Just a quick point on the passenger car ratio. We see monohulls in the Western Isles specified quite often around 8.1 ratio for passengers to cars. That's on the new vessels, around 1,000 passengers, 120 cars, whereas normally the ratio requirement, I think Joe Reid will cover this in his analysis of market and user needs, is the market only requires a ratio of about 4:1. This relates to the next point, which because there is a high passenger capacity specified for these vessels, they require a very large crew, which is double the catamaran, of about 30 crew as opposed to 12 or 13. And this, because there's also a preference to have live on board crews for CalMac services, this requires extra hotel decks and accommodation to be provided on the vessels, which increases the displacement and reduces the efficiency in turn, as the vessel has to carry effectively a hotel around for its entire life. Whereas normally on catamarans, on short run routes and other vessels, crews live ashore, although there can be some minimal cabins. So there are major competitive differences here that I would say put the catamaran in a much more favorable light. And that's why medium speed catamarans, steel hull catamarans, are increasingly popular and replacing monohulls around the world, not just in Scotland, although we're a bit slow to take on to this trend. Just a quick point here about where we are at the moment. Typically in the past, as we've seen for the last 13, 14 years, it's well known that catamarans are only costing about 1/3 that of the monohull, and that's largely a function of the different displacement requirements. But with the example of the Glen Sannox and her sister at Port Glasgow, and the price perhaps going up to 150 million for each vessel, including investment costs in the yard, this means that instead of buying vessels at 15 million pounds, as Pentland Ferries recently did with the new Alfred, the cost now for monohulls in Scotland is approaching 150 million pounds. For that, we could have bought 10 catamarans, or 20 for the price of 2 monohulls. And indeed, the designer of and the inventor of the medium speed catamaran, Stuart Ballantyne at Sea Transport Solutions in Brisbane, has 2 or 3 times offered Scottish Government the possibility to build his designs under license in Scotland at a fraction of the cost of monohulls. But unfortunately, they've declined this 3 or 4 times already. And that largely relates to what I've called here fallacies. And these are basically decisions made by officials making decisions on ferry acquisition and procurement that justify or appear to justify a rejection of catamarans and to confirm their decision for ordering and procuring monohulls to be a sensible decision, which I would argue with. And I've come up with several fallacies here which are raised regarding catamarans to reject catamarans, in my view, unfairly and not accurately at all. The first one is the reliability fallacy, then seakeeping, the port fallacy, a deadweight fallacy, cabins, regulations, and what I've called the big bundle fallacy. So I'll just go through each one of these very quickly. First of all, the reliability fallacy. We know from experience of Pentland Ferries, Pentalina, and now Alfred, that these catamarans, medium speed steel hull catamarans built for high sea states, operate extremely reliably in bad weather, in gale conditions, whereas quite often monohulls do not sail in the same conditions. And you can see here the chart on the right, the table showing the large monohull, 110 meter monohull Hamnavoe, unable to sail on several occasions this year during the storms that we had. What we found from research, what I've found from my research in this area over the years, and with the help of naval architects designing and building and operators of catamarans, is that the key benefits for the catamaran, it's much lower windage aids berthing. There's much lower windage compared to the monohull. The monohull has much higher decks. The catamaran also has 4 engines, whereas the monohull has only 2, and that aids redundancy, and also in relation to whenever a vessel, an engine is out, then the catamaran can still operate on 3 engines, whereas a monohull would have more difficulty operating on 1, if it could operate at all. A key attribute for the catamaran is the wide tunnel space, plus the 4 propellers as opposed to 2 propellers on the monohull. This aids maneuverability in confined harbour spaces. But fundamentally, what we've seen in the Orkney example, the Pentland Firth, is 10 years or more, very reliable operation of 4-prop catamarans, low windage catamarans. And in fact, I've got no hesitation in saying that the catamaran, in terms of reliability, is superior to a monohull. The second fallacy here is seakeeping, and this really goes back to earlier research, maybe 15 years ago, done in Scotland by a postgraduate researcher, which was commissioned by Scottish government agencies to look at catamaran seakeeping. Unfortunately, he decided to research a high-speed, lightweight aluminium vessel rather than a medium-speed steel hull catamaran like the Pentalina, which is a completely different vessel and classed to a different IMO code, not the high-speed craft code. So what we find with the seakeeping now is, with our experience of the catamarans in Scotland and elsewhere, and in line with naval architects' research findings too, is catamarans have a longer roll period than a monohull, which is actually aids comfort, has a much lower block coefficient, a much less resistance at the bow. And the bow shape is extremely important here, as well as the displacement, because that provides for less slamming or pitching. There's less speed loss with that in rough seas, as we find. And in fact, the stability calculations find that Sea Transport Solutions and other designers have done show actually superior survivability That's in part due to two hulls, because even in examples where one hull has been of a catamaran historically has been severely damaged, the vessel still remains afloat thanks to the other hull on the wet deck, whereas a comparable monohull would not be in the same position at all. I would also add here that the inventor and designer of the catamarans, medium speed catamarans, Stuart Ballantyne, helped establish the World Ferry Safety Association many years ago. And this was in answer to the disasters that were occurring in Asia, Philippines, Bangladesh, and so on. And his catamarans have been widely introduced throughout Asia, and he's currently doing 30 of these boats in the Philippines. So the survivability of these vessels is actually superior to monohulls. And I know that Sea Transport are doing work just now with Strathclyde on tank testing and so on, just to prove that in the Scottish dimension. Another fallacy is the port fallacy, in that decision makers here say catamarans don't fit CalMac ports. Here we see the catamaran Pentalina working at Orkney Ferry's monohull pier, if you like, the monohull pier, the Hoy Head, used by the Hoy Head for the Hoy run at Line S in Hoy. And she's offloading quite a lot of heavy equipment there for building the cable in Orkney. But the other chart here is from Mull and Iona Ferry Committee, rather, the Joe Reed's chart showing the alignment of stern ramps at Craignure. But essentially, the catamaran advantages simply is that they can use existing link spans. In fact, Pentland Ferry's catamaran Pentalina replaced two CalMac monohulls on the route from Gills to St Margaret's Hope, using the same facilities. Catamarans can be specified with aligned and split ramps to fit ramps. They can also use shorter piers because the catamarans for a given length, for a given capacity, are shorter than monohulls, having a much wider beam. They can also use shallower piers because catamarans have a shallower draft. So overall, there's lower, what we find with catamarans, and this is not just in Scotland, but globally, is there are much lower port infrastructure costs than catering for monohulls. So there's massive savings potentially across the whole network in Scotland to using catamarans for port infrastructure. Another fallacy is the dead weight, the argument that a catamaran can't carry enough dead weight, trucks and so on. But the issue with ferries is that ferries tend to max out on vehicle deck space, not dead weight. And I think Joe Reed has data on this tonight as well within the Mull context. So dead weight is less of an issue for ferries, for passenger ferries particularly. The catamaran can provide required trailer and car capacity and deadweight as a customer needs anyway. It's not really a problem. And there's also medium speed catamarans working today purely as freight carriers as well as passenger and car carriers. So the ferry has just the same flexibility as any monohull, if not more. A catamaran's wider beam, 50% wider beam than the monohull, obviously provides added deck space and easier handling of cars and other vehicles than a narrow monohull. And these are virtues rather than negatives. So the deadweight issue is really just another fallacy. The cabins, the argument is catamarans don't have cabins. Well, catamarans can be provided with as many cabins as anybody really wants, but the fact is, on short ferry routes of 1 hour or 2 hours even in Orkney, we know this, that the islands, the ferries do not have to have cabins or they do not have to have live on board available for the entire crew. Crews tend to go home in the evening and then come back to the ship in the morning. And this is normal for many, many routes now. Crews can mainly live ashore. There will be a few cabins on the boats, and there are in all catamarans. There are cabins for dry docking, for delivery voyage, but also for any sickness, for any rest required of people. But the idea that you have an entire hotel facility on a small ferry for a 1 or 2 hour crossing is really based on tradition, and is a mindset that we perhaps have to look at really seriously, because that is one of the big factors in raising the displacement of ferries and the power requirement, the emissions, and the overall efficiency and subsidy cost is locked into this mindset of having a large hotel on the top of a ship and having to carry that hotel around for 25 years. Another aspect of fallacies is the regulations, the idea that catamarans do not comply with the regulations. Of course, the MCA regulate all passenger ferries in the UK. Ships have to meet classification and certification requirements. And we know from the Orkney examples and others in the rest of Europe where medium speed catamarans are employed, that catamarans are compliant around the world, the same as other passenger ships. And those that have done research and worked in and built and designed and operated these vessels for many years regard catamaran safety to be superior. And once monohull ferry operators move towards catamarans, they never go back. And this is a thing we have to remember. They will seldom, if ever, go back. I know many operators around the world, in the Middle East, the Caribbean, Asia, who have moved from monohulls to catamarans, and in Scotland, of course, with Pentland Ferries, Andrew Banks' family's company, that once they move to catamarans, there's not really much point moving back, especially to vessels that cost 3 times as much to buy and operate. Finally, there's the big bundle fallacy. This is the long-standing argument that we need one massive fleet in the Western Isles because we need always one vessel to be a relief vessel in case something goes haywire in Arran or Islay or Barra or Mull. There should always be a vessel available. But of course, the relief vessel is always theoretical. It's a bit of a fallacy itself if it's available at the right time, the right place, or even the right size. Most major ship routes should be served in Scotland by, in my view, 2 lower cost catamarans. And this can be done because we know that catamarans can be built and operated for 1/3 the cost of a monohull. So even with 2 vessels, there's a big cost saving and plenty car capacity and vehicle and freight capacity can be provided on all routes. The thing with 2 vessels on a route, and there are literally hundreds, if not thousands of ferry routes around the world which have more than 2 or more vessels on a route, is the reason is because there's always then cover at all times if something happens with a boat, whether it's downtime or repair and maintenance, whatever, there's always cover. And in that case, there's no need for a fleet relief vessel. And without a doubt, routes like Mull, Islay, Arran, Stornoway, Ellerpool, all can easily justify 2 or more vessels. This means that the relief vessel on a fleet basis is not required. There's always relief cover immediately on the route concerned, and that's not a problem. It is a fallacy. So just to finally come to an end here, what is the motivation for these fallacies? Well, there is an argument here. It conveniently conceals unnecessary costs across the network. This is a very, very high cost system now in Scotland with probably the highest subsidy in the world, and it's not really replacing vessels as required. The fleet is aging badly, and efforts to design and build vessels recently have come a really bad cropper, and the opportunity of this is enormous for the islands. But the sad reality, we have to say, is that officials compared to private operators have very little incentive to do better. And state ferry agencies don't really operate in what we might call a competitive market. Even although there's a tender process every several years, there is only one monopoly ship provider, and that largely determines the operations and the cost structure. So it is not, in any sense of the word, a competitive market. And just to finish, really, this chart on excellent efficiency shows the managerial difference in terms of average cost curve of the catamaran being much lower than the average cost curve of the monohull. And the gap is showing the excellent efficiency, which has to be filled by ever more subsidy. And that really is the reality of the situation we face. We don't have a technically efficient fleet. We don't have a system that meets the needs of users. We have a very high cost system. And although ministers will go into the parliament and claim that they're spending record amounts on ferries in Scotland, they are indeed spending record amounts on ferries, but it's not necessarily spent very wisely, as we can see what's happening at Port Glasgow. So, conclusions, where are we? Compared with the monohull, catamaran ferries are twice as efficient in terms of revenue deadweight, and that's really the big point, the displacement and the deadweight. They reduce fuel consumption and CO2 emissions by half. Catamarans can be built far more rapidly and at a third the capital cost of monohulls. Catamarans operate at less than half the operating cost. We know for sure, without a doubt, that catamaran ferries built for high sea state operations provide very reliable year-round service and offer excellent seakeeping and comfort. We know they can use existing ports and only require minor modifications, if that. Catamarans will provide sufficient vehicle capacity and deadweight for any market needs, and can offer crew cabins if required, but a move to shore-based crewing, shore-based accommodation is advisable. Catamarans also, we know, comply with international and national regulations. And in the case of major ferry routes in Scotland, 2 catamarans on most major routes will always ensure relief cover. And I would add protects jobs, because although you don't require the same amount of crew on a catamaran, if you've got more vessels, like 2 catamarans instead of 1 monohull, you need the same amount of employment in that sense. It's just splitting the employment across 2 vessels rather than 1. And also allowing these crews to go home at night and to have a bit more of a normal social life. And that's me. Thank you very much.